is about React, right? So people coming from only JavaScript world, you should stick back and you should see this video, because there are some fundamental concepts of React which we need to discuss before touching React Native. And people who are already aware with and well versed with React, well and good. If you want, you can stay back, it will be a revision for you, and if you want, you can directly skip into the React Native part, right? So let's get started. On Google, let's go and search Code Sandbox, and on Code Sandbox we can click on React, right? So React is basically a library which helps us to build really nice websites, right? So the moment you look into this piece of code, right, it immediately looks like a normal JavaScript function called as app, and which actually it is a normal JavaScript function. And if you look into this piece of code, it looks very familiar because it's just normal HTML elements, right? But the difference here is now a function is returning HTML elements. So since the HTML is now in your JavaScript file, so whatever you return is generally referred as JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML, right? So the JavaScript is the function and XML is your HTML, and XML, you know, they are from the same family, right? So this is called as JSX, right? So now what is happening here is we are saying that we have a function, and that function is called as app, and we are returning an HTML, right? As simple as that. Now since we are returning HTML, or now we'll refer it to as JSX, this function doesn't stay a normal function anymore, but rather people and in React world we refer it as a component, right? So let's quickly create our own component, and instead of writing function this way, we'll create an arrow function, and we'll say test component, and what it will return is it will return a simple div, and in the div I'll say I am test component, and I'll close this div. Now if I place it here, you should be able to see this thing, right? So I can do something like array dot from, and I'll say length as 10, and now I'll do a map operation dot map, and I'll say item, and what I'll return is I'll return test component. If I do that, you can see that now 10 times it's getting printed, right? For some reason it refreshed. I have no idea why it did, but yeah, you can see that now 10 times we can see the test component getting rendered, right? So the advantage of components is that you get the power to reuse, so which we will be discussing. We will not do that right now straight away, but yeah, this is what a component is, right? And since this is a function, and this function is basically returning a JSX, so it is a component, but not just a normal component, but rather we'll refer it as a functional component. There is one more type of function in React which is called as class-based component, which we are not going to look into it because now it has kind of become obsolete. There are still pieces of code there are still things which can only be achieved by class-based component, but there are only like if I'll count maybe 10 things which requires class-based component. So we'll not discuss that thing, we'll stick to the functional component, right? So this is what React is about. It basically lets you create components. Those components can be used in a bunch of places, right? And one more thing which is very important in React is called as states, right? So if I say let count is equal to 0, and let's say if I have a on click on this div, okay, I will rather put this on click on this h1 because I need to click somewhere, right? And I'll say count plus plus, and if I try to render the count here in h2, what do you think is gonna happen? So you can see this h1 is basically hello code sandbox. If I click on it, this function will be called. If I do a console.log, and let me log this count only, reject all, and if I do this, let's quickly open the terminal, and if I do this, we are seeing that the count variable is getting incremented, and that same count we are using here also, but it is still persisting its initial value. The reason is React has a rule that inside JSX, if you want the data change should be reflected, you cannot use normal JavaScript variable. Rather, you have to use something called as useState, right? So I'll say set count. Let me write the syntax and things will be clearer. And I also need to perform an import useState from React. Okay, now what I'll do is, instead of directly incrementing it, I'll say set count and I'll say count plus plus. Now if I click on this, you can see that now it is working. So the whole thing here is that in React, if you have a normal JavaScript variable and if that variable changes, and if you're using that variable in your JSX, it will not trigger a re-render. You will not be able to see the latest value. So in order to see the latest value of a variable, you have to use a special type of variable called as state, right? And the way you're gonna create a state is by using something called as a hook. So in React, there are special functions. Those special functions which starts with the term with the keyword use, they are referred as hooks. So use state is one of the hooks. We are going to see a bunch of other hooks, but let's just stick to use state, right? So use state basically expects an initializer value, right? So we are passing 0, so it will initialize count as 0, right? And now what this use state will do, use state always returns an array with exactly 2 elements, the first element being the state itself and the second element the setter function, right? So we are just destructuring the same, right? And we are just saying that, okay, first element we are going to call as count and second element we are going to call as set count, right? And it's a good idea if you keep it as a const. And so this is how React works. You may be wondering why we need all these things, but we are going to discuss all those things. But yeah, we have to remember there's something called as states, right? If we want our JSX to be re-evaluated, if there is a data change, then we have to use states. We cannot use just a normal JavaScript variable. Now also one thing we have to see, you can see that when we are writing h1, we can straight away write things, right? But if you want to write some JavaScript inside your JSX, you have to use the brackets, right? So these are some of the concepts which you should know at this point of time. And I think if you would have understood this thing and if you would have practiced the same on Code Sandbox or maybe locally, we are good to start with our React Native. That's all I can say. So thank you guys. Let's catch up in the next video.